So, to briefly introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Carson, PhD, is a clinical associate professor and founding director of the Dementia Engagement Education and Research Program in the School of Public Health at the University of Nevada, Reno. In addition to other grant-funded initiatives, the DEAR program provides an administrative home for dementia-friendly Nevada, with Jennifer serving as its director. In this role, she engages diverse communities to promote brain health and enhance dementia support. With extensive field experience and a commitment to participatory research, Jennifer also partners on Nevada's CDC-funded Bold Public Health program. She received the Mensa Foundation Laura Joyner Award in 2022 and the UNR Foundation Established Innovator Award in 2024 for her transformative work in dementia care and support. So with all that said, Dr. Carson, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Alzheimer's Orange County, for this opportunity to discuss rights-based dementia care today. One thing that was not in that lovely introduction, Lauren, is that I am an Orange County native. I was born and raised in Buena Park and lived there until high school and still have family in the area. So it's nice to at least be with you virtually, though I really wish I could be there in person. The other thing I want to mention, just by way of introduction, is that I'm a family care partner, like many of you, I imagine. In fact, I imagine some of you, like me, are both a professional and a family care partner. In 2016, one of my parents was diagnosed with Lewy body and vascular dementia. And so as we have this exploration of rights-based dementia care today, know that I'll be drawing upon, I think, both my professional experiences in the field, as well as my thoughts and values as a family care partner. And so I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you in the chat box as well as part of this exploration. So let's jump in. These are our learning opportunities for today. We're going to explore the principles of rights-based dementia care. Specifically, I'm going to offer two frameworks for exploration today. There's many others, but we only have time maybe to explore two. And so I picked the two that have resonated most with me. And then after talking about these frameworks a bit, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and really look at the rights, dignity, and autonomy of people who are living with dementia. I know that we all want to support the well-being of people living with dementia. And one of the best ways we could do that is to ensure that people who are living with dementia have their rights, dignity, and autonomy upheld and fully supported. And then to end, we're going to explore some important legal and ethical considerations on the topic of dementia inclusion. That's why I have a kind of an inspirational photo here that was taken by a good friend of mine, Matt Perry, of his mother, who lived her last days in a locked and segregated memory care community. And so we're going to talk about memory care today. We're going to use it as an example as we're having this discussion about rights and who has the right to choose certain aspects of care and support. And so we could apply these rights-based frameworks to other questions as well. But just for the sake of today's exploration, I'm going to keep it focused on memory care and the topic of dementia inclusion. I want to acknowledge first two of my dear friends and collaborators. The three of us are currently writing a book together on the topic of dementia inclusion and really opening the doors of memory care. Seen here with me at beautiful Lake Tahoe, near where I live in the state of Nevada, is Dr. Al Power, who is a geriatrician. He's also author of two award-winning books, Dementia Beyond Drugs and Dementia Beyond Disease. He is also a researcher with the Schlegel University of Waterloo Research Institute for Aging, where he serves as the Schlegel Chair in Aging and Dementia Innovation. And then our dear friend and other collaborator, Pat Sprigg, who spent her career supporting dementia inclusion as the CEO of Carolwood's Retirement Community in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Since opening their doors in 1978, this senior living community to over 500 residents has been fully dementia inclusive, not a locked door anywhere on that campus. 500 residents, half of whom were living with dementia, and under Pat Spriggs' leadership, they were able to ensure that people receive care and support based on their healthcare needs and their housing preferences and not based on their cognition. So I want to thank Al and Pat for all of their contributions to my thinking on this subject. And if you like the content I'm sharing today, if it piques your curiosity in any way, know that there should be a book in the near future. I want to start here with the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Of course, this is everyone's goal when we're talking about dementia support and dementia care. Do no harm. I read this book a number of years ago, Broadening the Dementia Debate Towards Social Citizenship, written by Bartlett and O'Connor. And what they observe through their research is that the most oppressive and discriminatory practices in the context of dementia care and support often have their foothold in the well-meaning, well-intentioned ideas of those least intending to do harm. That some of the worst things happening in the field are coming from people who have the best of intentions, not bad people, maybe just some bad ideas or misinformation, or what the late Richard Taylor says, maybe perhaps due to some misconceptions of dementia. This is Dr. Richard Taylor, who lived and died with dementia, probably the Alzheimer's type. Many of you may remember Richard from his book, Alzheimer's from the Inside Out. He wrote about his experience as a psychologist living with dementia. He was a tremendous self-advocate. But what Richard said is that I believe, disabled as a consequence of misconceptions of dementia and the fear these misconceptions create. So good people working in the field, I don't know any care partners who are doing it for the money, but some really bad practices are happening. And in my career, spanning 4 decades now, I've got to tell you, as I go through today's content, know that this is a self-reflection, and I will be sharing critiques of practices that were once my own. This is not a judgment on our field, a judgment-free zone, 100% here. We are good people. We're all good people, but our knowledge is evolving. And thank goodness, because if our knowledge was not evolving, then I would still be restraining people living with dementia into their wheelchairs and chairs and beds using physical restraints. Or nurses, my mom who worked in long-term care as a nurse for many decades would still be giving people chemical restraints. And so know that we continue to learn and evolve. There's no judgment here, just an opportunity for us to explore this topic of rights-based dementia care with a beginner's eyes, right? Hopefully to just ask some really important questions that are worth asking because human lives are at stake. I love this quote by Maya Angelou. I did then what I knew how to do, and now that I know better, I do better. So I'm a former memory care operator myself. Pictured here is the first memory care community that I helped open in the state of Washington. It was actually the first memory care community in the state of Washington. This is back in the mid-90s. And looks right, very residential. I was really proud of my work opening this community. And at the time, it really was the embodiment of what I considered to be the least restrictive environment. Other environments in the 90s for people living with dementia were really institutional. Some of you may remember those days. And so this was a far cry better. It was a real step toward person-centered care and a physical design that was actually therapeutic. And I was really proud of this work. But one day I was a program director of this team, and a resident named Margaret, she was a former professor. She was trying to get out the front door because despite how beautiful it was, she honestly did not want to be there. Her family moved her in there for her own good. And so Margaret, was trying to get out and the alarms are going off. And I did the song and dance that many of you are probably familiar with. Oh, hey, how about let's go get lunch? Or, hey, when that didn't work, Margaret, how about if I just walk with you? I could really use some fresh air. Well, she didn't want me to go with her. She just wanted to leave. And with tremendous clarity, Margaret turned to me and said, "What right do you have to keep me in this place? What right do you have?" And I have to tell you all a confession. I didn't know the answer to the question. I didn't know if I had the right to keep Margaret behind the locked doors of memory care. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today has been an exploration for me of trying to answer that question thoughtfully. I didn't know what to say to Margaret. By the end of this presentation today, I think I have arrived at my best understanding. And I hope that you can ask yourselves the same question as well. In fact, let's go ahead and reflect on that question for just a moment. Pause and reflect. When does a person living with dementia require a secured environment? Who should make this decision? And based on what criteria? Okay, so we're talking about putting someone behind locked doors, perhaps for the rest of their life, right? So when does a person need to make that move? Who makes that decision, and what criteria should people use? What you see on the slide here is an actual evaluation for placement secured environment that comes from a partner organization in the state of Nevada where I live. So this, you can see they started this assessment May of 2021. It looks like they finally got a physician to sign off on it March of 2022. Not sure what that was about. And they assessed why would this person benefit. And you can see here, there's really no comments from the physician, but the word yes, secured environment is needed, yes. And so my question to you, using the chat box, if you'd like, is this evaluation sufficient to determine a move into a secured environment? Why or why not? So I'll give just a moment for you all to reflect on that a bit here. And we're going to keep coming back to this evaluation as we explore these different rights-based frameworks for decision making. We're going to problematize it quite a bit, but I'd love to know, just as a starting point for this discussion, what are your thoughts? And by the way, I'm not trying to pick on any providers. I'm sure I did something very similar to this earlier in my career. Again, judgment free. It's kind of the Wild West out there when it comes to making these decisions, if I'm being perfectly honest.
So we got a couple people answering. We have no, and no because there does not appear to be any safety risk or poor judgment of the individual. And again, a couple more no's. And then someone said, bet the guardian family member was aggressively assertive in pushing the doctor, possibly including comments of liability for what would happen to or at the hands of the patient if this didn't occur.
Well, here's what happened. Based on this evaluation, a male resident was moved from his apartment in an assisted living behind the locked doors of memory care. It was a dementia care neighborhood, right? Memory care neighborhood, against his will. This resident had the wherewithal to contact our state long-term care ombudsman, who then advocated on his behalf, and he moved out. Okay, so it was determined that this is indeed completely insufficient. And we're going to unpack that more. Like, why is this a problem? And is this happening in Orange County? Is this happening across California? Is this happening across the United States? I suspect that it is. I suspect that it is. So one of the rights-based frameworks I want to introduce you all to, and I love it, it's a great little acronym called FRIDA, and that was my great-grandmother's name, so it's easy for me to remember. FRIDA. FRIDA is a framework that for human rights dementia practice based on ensuring fairness, respect, equality, identity, dignity, and autonomy. Okay, FRIDA. And we're going to unpack this a little bit more together. But what I want to let you all know, this is me and my dad and my brother pictured here. When my dad was diagnosed with dementia in 2016, we started having conversations, not just about his preferences for care setting, but all kinds of choices. There were so many decision points along the way, and we wanted to make sure that we were honoring my dad's human rights. So one of the frameworks that we didn't, it was not yet published at the time. The FRIDA, FREDA framework was published in 2016, but not the one with the I that includes identity. But based on the FRIDA framework, it really gave me a map for considering how to engage my dad in a way that really honors his rights to be part of these types of decisions. And so let's break this down. These are statements that are written from the first person perspective of people living with dementia that reflect these FRIDA principles in the context of dementia. First, fairness. People living with dementia would like for care partners to not make assumptions about them. Let's have some thoughtful assessment. Give time and space to hear information, to interpret that, to make decisions. Do not exclude me because of my decision. For some people, this means don't exclude me from decision making. For others, it means do not exclude me from my community or from my family, because that is also unfair. Respect. Listen to me. Find out what is important to me. Make a positive effort to know me deeply, right? Speak to me. Don't talk to my family care partner, turn and only speak to them. Include me in these discussions. Equality, give me an opportunity to provide input into my own care. My dad, by the way, interviews and selects his own professional care partners, right? And so that's really important. Respect my culture, race, and religion. Know that I have the right to intimate relationships. And even living with dementia, I have the right to vote. Identity. Here's some statements that reflect this principle of identity. Respect my personhood. Recognize my skills and talents. Respect my choices about how I want to live my life. Even if there is disagreement between us, this is my life. Don't embarrass me, right? Don't embarrass me. Ask for my opinion. Don't patronize me. Don't talk to me like I'm a child. If you're helping me, explain what you're doing. And then finally, some statements that reflect the principle of autonomy. Give me the freedom to do what I want, which may include taking risks. Right? Risk is an inherent part of life. Right? Every time that you're thinking about the downside of risk, this principle would encourage us to also reflect on the upside of risk. And with my family, my dad, he likes to take risks. My brother and I never ask the question, oh my gosh, what might happen if we, support dad in doing this, without also asking the question, oh my gosh, what could happen if we don't support dad in doing this? Help me make decisions for myself. Don't make decisions for me, make decisions with me. Help me to be an empowered decision maker. Sure, you can give me advice. My dad loves my advice, I tell you what. But don't try to control me. Don't try to control me. So these are really wonderful first-person statements that reflect the FRIDA principles for rights-based decision-making in the context of dementia. So if we take this framework and we apply it to this same evaluation for placement in a secured environment, Does it inspire any new thinking? Is this evaluation sufficient to determine a move into a secured environment? Well, if I think about my dad, who, by the way, said that he, it's going to sound kind of tragic to say this, but I'm just being honest with all of you. My dad, who's a retired sheriff in LA County, said that he would shoot himself before he moves into a locked memory care environment. And as a gun owner, kind of believed him. So, these are, I take my dad's preferences to heart. And it kind of hurt in a way because I had spent decades building memory care communities to, be wonderful environments. But my dad said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. When I think about my dad, if this was his assessment and we just moved him in, he would have said, first of all, don't exclude me because of my dementia. In this case, he'd be talking about excluding him from his community and from his family. My dad would probably say, hey, whoa, 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 Jenny, find out what's important to me. Like, don't think about what you think is best for me. Find out what I think is important. Um, Give me input into my own care, right? Everyone should have a choice in care and care setting, right? Everyone gets to have a choice in care and care setting. Respect my choices about how I want to live my life. My dad is comfortable having some risk in his life. And so we need to honor that. Do not embarrass me, my dad might say. It's because he would feel stigmatized by moving into a memory care environment. I know people who have made that choice themselves to move into a memory care environment because they want to feel more included and with people who aren't going to judge them. But for my dad, he found that very embarrassing. And then finally, give me the freedom to do what I want, which may include taking risks. Okay. And so when I think about this kind of assessment and the decision that was made, yeah, let's move this man into locked and secured memory care, it makes me wonder to what extent were they engaging with the freedom principles, rights-based decision making. All right, another framework I want to offer to all of you comes from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. You might hear this referred to as the CRPD. And this treaty, it's a human rights treaty, was actually formalized in 2006. So it's been around for a while. And it has been ratified by countries all around the globe, but not the United States. And the reason why it hasn't been ratified in the US isn't because it's not a wonderful treaty. It's because we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and some of our legislators believed that that was sufficient. And so even though President Obama did make an effort to ratify this during his presidency, it never was. And so, however, even though it's not ratified in the US, it can still serve as a really important benchmark for human rights-based practices in dementia services globally. So we could use this as our guiding compass to ensure the rights of people who are living with dementia are being upheld and protected and promoted. I know that it's called the CRPD, and the D is about disabilities. And I think that's important framing for dementia. Dementia, yes, absolutely, is a syndrome, and a lot of people look at it as a disease, and I'm not arguing that point. But a lot of people are living with dementia much more like a chronic condition or a disability. I personally know people who've been living with Alzheimer's. I co-host a program every Monday with Chuck McClatchy, an incredible self-advocate who's been living with Alzheimer's for over 10 years. I have a book on my bookcase in my office written by Christine Bryden, another tremendous self-advocate, after her 20th year post-diagnosis, right? 20 years of dementia self-advocacy. So a little, if we can frame dementia as a disability, then there are certain protections for people living with dementia that would not necessarily be received if we only see it as a disease. And so disability framing can be really helpful in this rights-based conversation. So the CRPD calls for recognizing persons living with disabilities, including people living with dementia, as active citizens with rights and capable of making decisions for their lives based on free and informed consent. It calls for a paradigm shift to no longer viewing people living with dementia just from that biomedical perspective, but from a human rights perspective. And if you read the CRPD, you will see a series of principles that I want us to just briefly unpack together here. Capacity assessment. Okay, so is this how are certain decisions or the worthiness of certain decisions be judged or assessed? Is there a thoughtful process? Was that assessment for placement behind the locked doors of a memory care neighborhood, was that sufficient when we're talking about a capacity assessment? It sounds like in the chat box, think that was sufficient is living with dementia. What's the stakeholders' involvement in decision making? How are we demonstrating that we're respecting the individual's needs and preferences? And then, of course, people have a right to holistic approaches to care, not coercive approaches. And then finally, looking at issues about protection against abuse, neglect, and discrimination. So if we bring these principles into this conversation, again, is this evaluation sufficient to determine and move into a secured environment? If we're really looking at the CRPD principles. And feel free, again, if you want to put your answer in the chat box. And what I wonder in learning a little bit about these principles is, has it opened your eyes to a different perspective in any way? Let's take a deeper look at each one of these. And this is how we're going to spend the rest of our time together. We'll just spend a couple minutes on each one of these. So first, let's look at capacity assessment. And it's important to note that capacity assessment is different from a cognitive assessment, but they can definitely be connected in an important way. But capacity is a functional assessment that is made by a clinician. And unless your family care partner is also a clinician, probably not by family care partners. And so a clinician can make this determine capacity on a decision by decision basis. And that clinician is asking, is this person capable of making a specific decision? This is different from competency. Competency is a global assessment and legal determination that's made by a judge in a court, okay? And so in a capacity assessment, we're trying to determine whether or not this person can give informed consent. Can they make decisions about whether or not to participate in research? Can they manage their own finances or live independently, make a will? Can they drive? And so what's really important, there's a thoughtful assessment, and that people living with dementia are not just assumed to have impaired capacity without a thoughtful process. Even a person living with moderate or severe dementia, even if they have obviously impaired capacity, may still be able to indicate a choice and to show some understanding for specific decisions. So capacity assessment, different from cognitive assessment, but oftentimes that clinician will do a comprehensive cognitive assessment as part of that capacity assessment. But while I'm thinking about my years of working in memory care, what I know is that many people were moved in to the memory care communities where I worked, never even having a comprehensive cognitive assessment. Many people were diagnosed with dementia, which isn't even a diagnosis, based on a simple cognitive screen. Cognitive screens are really important. It is a first step in a process that should always include that comprehensive cognitive assessment by a qualified in an effort to get an diagnosis. When I think about how many people I have supported in memory care who were judged about whether or not they needed to be there based only on a cognitive screen. And I've heard stories from my local ombudsman about people living with dementia getting diagnosed from a cognitive screen provided by a dermatologist. Now, dermatologists are important people for sure and very important providers, but I don't think that they are qualified in diagnosing dementia. So it's really important to get that comprehensive cognitive assessment. So now let's talk about information disclosure. There was a systematic review conducted in 2018 that found that only 34% of general practitioners reported disclosing a suspected dementia-related diagnosis to patients. Why are they not disclosing information to their own patients? Especially when we know the benefits of early detection and diagnosis. A lot of providers, sadly and mistakenly, believe that there is no hope, but there's a lot of hope and there's a lot that can be done. And so it is really important as we talk about an information disclosure that healthcare providers and general practitioners are actually disclosing when they suspect that a person should go get a comprehensive cognitive assessment. All right, stakeholders' involvement in decision-making. What you see on the screen here is a framework for authentic partnerships, partnering in decision-making, that I developed in partnership with some researchers from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and people living with dementia. So this was a participatory action research study where we worked with people living with dementia to understand what helps support stakeholder involvement in decision-making within the context of dementia. If we aren't intentional about supporting the involvement of people living with dementia in the decisions that affect their lives, we slip into tokenism, and nobody likes tokenism. Tokenism is having a seat at the table, like you're included at the table, but nobody's working to actively incorporate your perspective or to open up a space for your perspective to be heard. And so this framework, it articulates a series of principles and enablers to help stakeholder involvement in decision-making, not be tokenistic, but very authentic. And I have used this framework, which, by the way, if you look up this peer-reviewed journal article, there are reflection questions for each one of these principles and enablers that help us reflect on the strength of our partnership and how well we're doing working together and opening up those spaces for stakeholder involvement. I've used this framework. We actually use it in Nevada right now. It guides the work of Dementia Friendly Nevada to ensure that we're partnering with people living with dementia in that effort, making changes in our communities and state together and not on behalf of people who are living with dementia. I also use this framework to reflect on how well I'm including my dad in decision making. And I have used this framework even at the point of care. It's been really helpful. There are other frameworks as well. I think we all know what a good partnership looks like. But here's the takeaway I hope that to leave you all with when it comes to stakeholder engagement. When we work in genuine partnership with people who are living with dementia, then we don't just support personhood, which is a very worthy goal, no doubt, but instead we mobilize active citizenship. Partnerships take us from personhood to citizenship. The left-hand column, some of you might recognize as being the psychological needs of people living with dementia that were identified by Dr. Tom Kitwood in his groundbreaking person-centered care work. And these are, really important. These are psychological needs of people living with dementia, and I'd argue of all people. And then in the right-hand column, from Bartlett and O'Connor, is a framework about citizenship in the context of dementia. When we partner with people living with dementia, instead of just supporting people's comfort, which is important, we open up opportunities for people living with dementia to experience growth. Instead of just knowing people living with dementia well, when we work in an authentic partnership, we help that person have a social position, right? A social position. So important to continue to have a role and a purpose. Instead of just keeping people living with dementia busy, um, if we work in authentic partnership with people living with dementia, we help connect them with a genuine sense of purpose. Instead of just being included at the table, we help people living with dementia be full participants in decision making. Instead of just having a sense of attachment to a person or a place, what people living with dementia want is to also feel a sense of solidarity with others, that they are not alone. And while love and that psychological need for love is so important, can't be understated, the importance of love. People living with dementia, when we partner with them, what we help do is provide freedom from discrimination. Freedom from discrimination. And so authentic partnerships, that direct involvement in decision making, is what helps us promote active citizenship. The next principle then, respecting needs and preferences. And I have a picture here to remind me of a fable I read about, the fable of upstream and downstream, and about how, you know, we're, often fetching people out of the river who have fallen in and they're drowning, people who are in distress. And we build all of these fabulous systems of support for rescuing people downstream after they've already fallen into the river. And nobody's really asking why all these people are falling into the river in the first place. Okay. The fable of upstream, downstream. Instead of putting all these resources into strengthening our downstream reactive interventions, what would help us to be more proactive upstream so that people don't need rescuing? Well, one of the things that we could do is make sure that we are respecting each person's needs and preferences. If we're not respecting needs and preferences for each unique individual, then people will experience distress. They will experience distress. And sometimes we label this distress in our field, and I think it's incredibly unfair for us to do this. Sometimes we call these behavioral symptoms of dementia. So in fact, it's so common that we think of these expressions of distress as behavioral symptoms that some of you might be familiar with an acronym. We often toss around BPSD, behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. It's kind of a global phenomenon. Well, Christine Bryden, an incredible self-advocate living with dementia, said, look, care partners, you love your dumb acronym so much, you keep it, but let's call it what it really is: base personal signs of distress. I have fallen in the river, right? I am downstream and I am drowning, and I'm doing my very best to communicate that something ain't right, right? I have an unmet need, right? I'm experiencing distress, and I'm trying to tell you this in communicative stuff currently available to me. If we just dismiss this as somehow an inherent part of dementia, then we will never be able to meet that unmet need, and we certainly won't be able to be proactive upstream. What you see now here is a list of just some common causes of distress, and we all know this. This is common sense. If a person has an unmet need like pain, hunger, a lack of sleep, the need to use the bathroom but not knowing where it is, or not knowing how to get my belt undone, if I am experiencing a sense of boredom or isolation or have no purpose in my life, I'm going to be in distress. If my care partner is taking over decision making for me, right? They're making decisions for instead of decisions with. If I'm being silenced, yeah, I'm going to be in distress. Sometimes, people living with dementia have a hard time processing information, especially if it's coming too fast. That could cause distress. Sometimes people living with dementia have a hard time getting their words out, right? That can cause distress. Threats to personhood, autonomy, and freedom cause distress. right? So let's stop labeling it. Dementia symptoms or behavioral symptoms of dementia. It could be that it's a threat to an individual's personhood. When I worked in memory care many years, and I could tell you that I often ask myself, I wonder if the locked door is causing distress. And a number of years ago, I started reading some research on the subject, and absolutely, actually, locked doors are a primary cause of distress for many people who are living with dementia. But that distress again gets blamed on the dementia instead of looking at the trigger or the root cause. Feeling disoriented can cause distress. Having too much or too little going on in your environment can cause distress. Reacting to the emotional distress of others can cause distress. Okay, so common causes of distress. So knowing this, we all want to get upstream. Therefore, our primary goal as care partners should be supporting well-being proactively, supporting the needs and preferences of people who are living with dementia. And what you see here is a framework um, of well-being that I developed in partnership with people living with dementia and researchers again at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. We worked in partnership on this project. And people living with dementia said, as long as I have opportunities to stay connected to these meaningful experiences on a regular basis, I can live well with dementia. Opportunities to be with, to seek freedom and find balance, to make a difference, to grow and develop, and to have fun. As a professional and family care partner, I think of these as domains of well-being, and I imagine that each one is a glass. And if someone I'm supporting is in distress, I ask myself, or I ask that person, how full or how empty is each glass? And the good news is all the glasses are refillable, right? And the best way to refill those glasses to do in partnership with the person who is living with dementia, right? Not make assumptions, but figure out ways that we can help support these meaningful experiences on a regular basis. Now, knowing this, then instead of being downstream, what we need to do is develop proactive well-being plans to ensure that these needs and preferences are being supported proactively instead of us constantly having to refill the glasses. So very helpful framework. All right, holistic approaches in care practices. Person-centered care is still probably considered, in the United States at least, the gold standard. But in other places, like in the UK, for instance, they have continued to evolve and are embracing increasingly relationship-centered care as the preferred holistic approach to dementia care practice. And I really love relationship-centered care as well. And this is the approach that I use as both a family and professional care partner. And as you can see on the left in that little circle, it says, good care and support can only be achieved when all senses are experienced by the person living with dementia and their support partners. That's what I love about this framework is it says that as a care partner, I have a really hard time supporting your well-being unless I am also experiencing well-being. That all of our needs are important. We all have to have a sense of security, continuity, belonging, purpose, achievement, and significance in order to provide optimal care and support. One of the practices that could really help us advance relationship-centered care is dedicated care assignments. Whether this is in-home care or this is residential care settings, having the same care partners support the same elders most of the time without rotation is really best. And then obviously people have to have a day off or have some respite, in which case getting pretty much the same people to fill in for each other as often as possible is really helpful. Sometimes people will refer to this practice as consistent or permanent assignments. I feel like that sounds a little sterile. I like the word dedicated because it implies a certain commitment or desire to really form an authentic relationship with a person or with a group of people. And there are many advantages to this. That deep knowing relationship, which makes it easier for the person living with dementia to recognize their care partner they may not remember my name, but they might know my voice or my mannerisms or my touch. This helps build a deeper sense of trust. And this is really important when we're doing personal or intimate care. Plus, having far fewer people helping with personal or intimate care is very helpful. Having dedicated assignments in that deep knowing helps us better anticipate and be proactive in supporting people's preferences and needs. And it gives us that opportunity to understand a person without the use of words, right? Which is important as people continue to progress with dementia into the more advanced stages. When we're in this deep relationship, we're better at reading these nonverbal cues. It helps us be able to recognize emerging issues and again to respond. And and then it also engenders higher levels of trust with family care partners, and it even helps support close communication and collaboration between the other members of that care team or that circle of care. And what you don't only have to look back at the COVID pandemic to be reminded that dedicated assignments really helps promote better infection control. So the final principle that I want to briefly examine is about protection against abuse, neglect, and discrimination. Every human has rights, and as care partners, we should be asking the question, how do we help support those rights, just as often as we're asking the question about what can we do to support safety. Okay. And so let's look at this, this is my answer to the question about whether or not this is sufficient to determine to move to a secured environment. And I want to acknowledge briefly the California Advocates for Nursing Home Reform for their wonderful manual document called Your Right to Leave. This is a great guide. It's available for free download. And according to CANAR, this is their answer to the question, by the way, that all adults have the right to move freely and choose where they want to live and whether or not to receive healthcare services. When someone goes to a long-term care facility, they do not leave their rights at the door. They have every right not to be imprisoned, even if someone like a doctor or a facility administrator believes the resident does not have the capacity to make sound decisions. There's only one person who can restrict a resident's right to leave a long-term care facility, and that is a court-appointed conservator acting with specific authority to place a resident in a locked facility against the resident's will. Okay, so the doctor and the facility administrator do not have the legal authority to make that decision. Furthermore, back in 2015, what CANAR reports in their great guide is a decision made by the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is the agency in charge of the federal nursing home rules. And they held that nursing home residents may not be confined against their will, even if a power of attorney has consented. Otherwise, nursing facilities could be turned into prisons in which family members lock their relatives away purely for the sake of convenience. They're not saying that is why people do, move their loved ones into long-term care, but they want to make sure that they are protecting against that as a possible reason. The residents of nursing home facilities have rights, and those rights include the right to freedom of movement. So in the state of Nevada, learning from CANAR and the Right to Leave guide, we actually just in 2023, we adopted a new recommendation in the Nevada State Plan to address Alzheimer's disease and other dementias that guarantees the right to choice in care setting. And so again, you could Google this Nevada State Plan. It's freely available online. You could just download it. And if you read recommendation 17, what you'll see clearly articulated, and again, thank you, Tony Chicotel and CANAR for your wonderful document, which we drew from pretty extensively. You'll see that we cite the US Constitution, the Olmstead decision, and key nursing home and assisted living resident rights. The US Constitution says that liberty interests may not be deprived without due process of law. Without due process of law. There has to be a thoughtful legal process if you want to move someone behind the locked doors of memory care for the rest of their lives, unless the person consents themselves. Okay, that's a constitutional right. The United States Supreme Court 1999 Olmstead versus LC decision. This was a decision that said the medically unjustifiable institutionalization of persons with disabilities constitutes a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay. So, and then also what you'll find in recommendation 17 in our state plan are the key nursing home and assisted living resident rights that ensure that we are upholding respect and dignity, self-determination, freedom from abuse and restraints, including environmental restraints. And so I'd encourage you to check it out. What I did in the handout is I actually included some of the excerpts from the state plan for you. So at your leisure, please feel free to read through if this is a topic of interest to you. And know that this recommendation passed the Nevada State Plan unanimously, unanimous support. And so now we have a little bit of time for some additional discussion, questions, reactions, ideas. And also note in your handout is information about the DEAR program. If you follow that QR code, it will take you to our website where we have a whole bunch of free downloadable resources that we love to share. And then Lauren, when you're ready, know that I have your closing slides available too. Do you want those now or do you want a
Sure.
little dialogue first?
Yeah, no, if you want to
Okay.
go ahead,
All right.
yeah, and skip.
There you go, Lauren.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you so much, Dr. Carson. That was such wonderful and valuable information. I encourage now anybody that has questions to go ahead and put them in the chat box. We do have a few already. And the first one is, how would you advocate for patients' choices when families argue that what they are currently saying may not coincide with what they have made known prior to their disease?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that
Yeah,
question, Lauren?
yes.
That sounds like an important one.
It is, yes. How would you advocate for patient choices when families argue that what they are currently saying may not coincide with what they have made known prior to their disease? So if they're changing, but the person with dementia is changing their mind, how do you advocate for their new decisions?
Oh, okay. Well, people living with dementia have the right to change their minds. And so they can even change their mind about their power of attorney. So just because a person makes a decision, um, it is well within their right to change that decision. And so I'm not a legal expert, I'm a gerontologist, but this was my question as well. And I did ask the Nevada state rights attorney at the time, Jennifer Richards, she was our state rights attorney, on that very question. What happens when a person changes their mind? And she very clearly explained to me and other members of the task force for Alzheimer's disease that it is a person's right to change their mind, including to change their power of attorney.
Okay, perfect. And then another question is, it's lengthy, but I think there is too much focus on high functioning early dementia cases. We have people that are dangerous to themselves, danger to others, and unable to perform ADLs. Many people say they don't want to do things until there is no other option. But we have people unable to use appliances, which means that they can turn things on incorrectly, maybe possibly burning down their house or an apartment in a multifamily place, which is not okay.
Oh, so yes, I will respond to that statement. And I think that this is where the Olmstead decision is really helpful. And again, would just encourage people to refer back to that, Your Right to Leave Guide or the Nevada State Plan on Alzheimer's disease to read more about it. But, you know, in our country, everyone has the right to receive care and support in the least restrictive environment. And for some people, that might be memory care. But I think what we also have is the legal right to a thoughtful process to determine a person's capacities. And so I think that what we saw in the example I was sharing on the screen about that one assessment is that there was some effort made to assess whether or not a person needs a secured environment. It was not a very thoughtful assessment. It was perhaps not as detailed as it should have been, right? So I think what we need and what I advocate for in Nevada is the standardization of a comprehensive assessment process across residential care settings that can help people know whether or not placement in a secured environment indeed constitutes the least restrictive environment. And so right now, you could talk to our state long-term care ombudsman and probably the California state long-term care ombudsman as well, that there are many people who are being moved into memory care communities against their will, like I was saying earlier, based on a cognitive screen, not even a thoughtful, comprehensive cognitive assessment. And I put up that graphic earlier that shows, sometimes you think you're dealing with dementia. It could be depression, it could be delirium, it could be a confluence. But if we don't have a thoughtful assessment, how will we really know if that's the least restrictive environment? And how will we ever know if that person's experiencing some cognitive decline that is actually reversible? And so if we need to support the rights of people living with dementia to have access to comprehensive cognitive assessment. And I know that is much easier said than done. I live in a state where we are a neurology desert in Nevada. It's really hard to get a comprehensive cognitive assessment. But this is where I think we can work together as citizens towards some advocacy.
Okay, perfect. Perfect answer. Another person said, if I am no longer able to, I'm sorry, if I am no longer able or willing to care for a loved one and she refuses to move into another care situation in spite of an extensive assessment, what is one to do?
Right. So remember, the person who can help in that situation would be a court-appointed guardian.
Okay.
Right. And so again, always taking us back to the due legal process. And so there is a sanctioned legal process to help someone who's at risk. And you can also call Adult Protective Services to help with that process. But a court-appointed guardian, we rely on them to help us in these really difficult situations where we're really trying hard to help a person get the support they need, and they are at risk. But I also want to say, I want to balance that with just one thing. I know sometimes this topic can be provocative, obviously. And I think it's important to note that the vast majority of people who are living with dementia will never live behind the locked doors of memory care. Never. The vast majority of people living with dementia actually live in the community and will remain there. And so we know that we have success stories all across the country of how people are being supported in living with advanced dementia in the community and in the least restrictive environment. And so I think that we've kind of, to a certain extent, have been sold this idea that memory care is superior, and that it will have some superior outcomes. And I just want to let you all know that the evidence base on memory care is mixed and inconsistent. There is no evidence base that demonstrates superior outcomes to memory care.
It's very interesting. We don't have any more questions, so if anybody has any, last chance. But the general theme has been, is this recording going to be available? Yes, it will be. It will be on our Alls OC YouTube page, which I will post the link for everybody towards the end of the week. I know it was so much wonderful information and people are going to want to share it and talk about it. But again, so it looks like we have one last question. Perfect. What outcomes were being assessed in that research for the memory care?
So there's multiple. What I would encourage people, if they want to look at a systematic review of all available research, the last one there were two. One was conducted more recently, and the name is escaping me, but I remember Dr. Maggie Calkins in the 2018 Alzheimer's Association's practice recommendations reviewed all of the available research on memory care, and you have to understand she built a career designing memory care communities. And Dr. Calkins herself said, look, based on all the available research, there is no evidence base, that the outcomes are mixed and inconsistent at best. In other words, for every study that would show a positive outcome, she found a study with a negative outcome. So I think part of that is because there's no standardization for what it means to be a memory care community, other than the fact that they all have a locked door. But other than that common feature, I think we all know that the quality is all over the map.
Okay. And one last question. How is the do no harm balanced with letting a patient make decisions that could cause self-harm?
That is a deep question. And I think, and I don't take that because again, I ask this question as a family care partner every day. And I think what I have decided for myself is that my dad has the right to make bad choices also. My dad has the right to a certain degree of risk that he's comfortable with. And that's hard. That can sometimes be really hard as a family care partner. Mm-hmm. And so, but obviously you don't want people to experience self-neglect, yeah. And so I think that it's up to each person to also determine when is it time to maybe call adult protective services, to get some other eyes on the situation.
Mm-hmm. It just sometimes it feels it's easier and safer just to be totally restrictive versus allowing that risk and that, opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So again, thank you, Dr. Carson, so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And thank you all for joining us today. For further information regarding any resources, please call the ALS-OC helpline at 844-373-4400. Please remember to complete the survey as you exit the webinar. And thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks, Lauren.